The 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a quiet night in small-town Ohio. On the other end of the line, a woman's voice was breathless, trembling, and broken up by sobs. My husband's not breathing. Please hurry." There's the sound of something rattling, like the phone was shaking in her hand, followed by harsh, heavy breathing. She identified herself as Teresa Collins, 38, and gave an address on a sleepy suburban street where brick-roof houses sat under dim yellow porch lights. When the ambulance and police pulled up, the front door was wide open. Inside the living room, a small-framed man lay motionless on the couch, head tilted back, eyes glazed and fixed on nothing. Paramedics rushed over, pulling him onto the floor to start CPR. Standing nearby was a massive woman, sweat-soaked, hair tangled, face flushed, mumbling, "I don't know what happened. He was just sitting there," and then her voice cracked, but her eyes flickered with something the officers couldn't quite read. Mark Collins, 42, weighed barely 135 pounds. Teresa towered over him, her body easily more than triple his size. As the medics worked frantically, a young patrol officer standing off to the side couldn't help but notice the difference. He heard one EMT mutter under his breath, "Jesus, she must weigh over 400. The officer scribbled in his notebook, keeping his face neutral, "Possible accidental death due to weight disparity." Teresa wasted no time offering her version of events. She claimed Mark had been packing his things when he slipped and fell into the couch. She said she panicked, tried to shake him awake, and when that failed, she called for help. I didn't do anything," she insisted, her words coming a little too quickly, as if she wanted to cut off any questions before they could start. Outside, the Ohio night was still and cold. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance reflected off neighbors' windows. A few curious faces peeked out from behind curtains. People on this street had heard shouting from the Collins house before, saw Mark come and go with a tight jaw, heard Teresa's voice raised in rage, but no one thought it would end like this. One of the investigators stepped inside, eyeing the couch where Mark had been sitting before he died. The cushions were sunken deep, as though they'd been forced down under tremendous weight. He jotted that detail down, then glanced over at Teresa, widowed only minutes ago, now covering her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling in what looked more like performance than grief. No one in that living room knew that within weeks, national headlines would explode with the story, 440-pound wife kills husband by sitting on him. No one knew that this wasn't an accident at all, but the brutal climax of months of jealousy, resentment, and a chilling promise Teresa had made more than once. "I'll sit on you until you never get up again." But in that moment, under the cold light and the sharp tang of antiseptic, all anyone could see was a small man who would never take another breath, and the massive shadow of the woman who claimed to love him, looming over the truth. They met on one of those sticky summer nights when the air feels heavy and the beer goes down easy. Mark Collins had stopped by Murphy's Tavern after a long day at the auto shop. He was the kind of guy who didn't draw attention when he walked into a room, 5'7", lean, with a quiet demeanor that made people underestimate him. He'd nursed the same pint for nearly an hour when Teresa walked in. Back then, she was nothing like the woman the world would later see in mugshots. At 34, Teresa had an athletic build, sun-kissed skin from weekend hikes, and a laugh that carried across the bar without feeling forced. She wore jeans and a fitted white t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she had the kind of easy confidence that made people lean in when she talked. She plopped down on the bar stool next to Mark and ordered a whiskey sour. He glanced over, gave a polite nod, and expected that to be the end of it. Instead, she smiled at him, that big, open smile, and said, "You look like a guy who could use a better drink." It was a small thing, but in that moment, she had him. They talked until last call about music, old cars, and how both of them had been burned in love before. Mark told her about growing up in a small town, how he'd always been the skinny kid people doubted until he proved himself with his hands in the garage. Teresa shared that she'd been divorced for almost 2 years, no kids, trying to figure out what's next. Their first date was the very next weekend. Mark took her to a small lakeside diner that made the best pecan pie in 3 counties. He liked that she wasn't afraid to joke, even on a first date. Over the next few months, they became inseparable. Teresa would stop by the shop with lunch for him, usually sandwiches and sweet tea, and stay to chat while he worked under the hood of a car. Mark's friends noticed he was different around her, more relaxed, happier. He'd been through a rough breakup a year earlier, and Teresa seemed to light something back up in him. Even his sister, who'd been skeptical of anyone he dated, admitted that Teresa was good for him. She had a way of making him feel bigger than he was. Teresa would brag about him to strangers, how handy he was, how he could fix anything, how he treated her like a queen. Mark, who wasn't used to that kind of praise, ate it up. He thought she saw him for who he really was, not just a wiry guy with grease on his hands. By the time fall rolled around, they were talking about marriage. It wasn't some grand proposal with roses and candlelight. One night, sitting on the hood of his truck under a sky full of stars, Mark simply said, "I think you're it for me, Teresa." She smiled, kissed him, and replied, "Then let's not waste any more time." Their wedding was small, 30 people in the backyard of Mark's childhood home. Teresa wore an ivory-laced dress that hugged her figure, and Mark couldn't stop smiling. They danced barefoot in the grass to an old country song, while friends and family clapped along. There were no signs, no shadows hinting at what would come years later. In those early days, they were just another couple in love. They dreamed out loud about buying a bigger house, maybe starting a family. Mark pictured Teresa teaching their kids how to bait a fishing hook. She imagined him showing them how to change a tire. It was ordinary, simple, and exactly what Mark thought he wanted after years of feeling like he was always chasing something he couldn't catch. Back then, the idea would have been impossible. She was the love of his life. And for a while, he was sure he was hers. The first crack in their marriage didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. They came quietly, like slow leaks you don't notice until the floor is already warped. It started about a year after the wedding, when Teresa stopped going on their Sunday drives. She claimed she was tired, or that her back hurt, and instead of packing lunches for Mark at the shop, she began sending him money for takeout. Her once active lifestyle faded into late nights on the couch, streaming TV with a bag of chips balanced on her lap. At first, Mark brushed it off. Everyone changes a little after settling down, right? But the changes weren't small. She started skipping the hikes she used to love. By their second anniversary, Teresa had gained close to 100 pounds. She laughed it off in front of friends, calling herself a curvy queen, but Mark could see the strain it put on her. Their physical intimacy slowed to a trickle. Mark tried to be supportive, telling her she was beautiful no matter what, but he missed the woman who used to dance barefoot in the grass with him. And it wasn't just her body that changed. Her personality shifted too. The easy laugh that had first drawn him in was replaced by sharp edges. She became suspicious, quick to anger, picking apart everything he said. If he came home late from the shop, she wanted to know where he'd been, who he'd talked to. At first, Mark tried to chalk it up to stress. Teresa had taken on fewer shifts at her job, and money was tighter. But even when things eased up financially, the tension didn't go away, it got worse. She began making comments about how he looked too thin and too friendly with the women who brought their cars into the shop. Her jealousy was suffocating. She'd show up unannounced while he was working, sometimes staying for hours, sitting in the corner with her arms crossed. Home didn't feel like home anymore. The little one-story house they'd bought together seemed smaller by the day, not just because Teresa's size made it harder to move around, but because the air between them felt heavy. By their 5th year of marriage, Teresa's weight had climbed past 350 pounds. Mark worried about her health, suggesting doctor visits, or maybe joining a gym together. But every time he brought it up, she'd accuse him of not loving her anymore. "You knew who I was when you married me," she'd snap. "If you don't like it, you can leave." And yet, she made it clear that leaving wasn't really an option. When Mark once hinted that maybe they needed a break, her face went cold. At the time, he took it as a figure of speech. Later, he'd realize it wasn't. Mark's friends started noticing he wasn't himself. He stopped going out for beers, stopped showing up at poker night. When asked why, he'd shrug and say he was tired. The woman who once made him feel bigger than he was now made him feel smaller every day. And yet, there were still moments, fleeting ones, when she'd curl up next to him on the couch and rest her head on his shoulder, and he'd remember the woman he married. He held on to those scraps, hoping they meant things could go back to the way they were. But deep down, he knew something had shifted for good. The warmth between them had cooled, replaced by suspicion, resentment, and a creeping sense of danger he couldn't quite name. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the mattress dip under her weight beside him, and wonder if he'd ever feel free again. If you had asked him then, Mark wouldn't have been able to tell you exactly when he stopped feeling safe in his own home. But the truth is, by that point, the house they'd built together was no longer a refuge. It was a cage, and Teresa was making sure the door stayed locked. It happened slowly, in the same way most dangerous things do, quietly enough that Mark didn't see the line until he'd already crossed it. Her name was Jenna Wallace, a 29-year-old with bright hazel eyes and a laugh that could cut through the noise of the shop floor. She brought in her old Honda Civic one afternoon, complaining about a rattling sound in the engine. Mark slid under the hood, made a few adjustments, and 30 minutes later, the noise was gone. She thanked him with a smile that lingered just a moment too long. "Guess I'll have to come back if I need rescuing again," she joked. It was harmless. At least that's what he told himself. But after months of living with Teresa's suspicion and sharp tongue, that little bit of warmth felt like a drink of water to a man who'd been walking through the desert. Jenna came back a week later, this time with coffee for him. "You look like you could use this," she said, handing over a paper cup with his name scrawled on the side. They talked while he checked her brakes. Nothing personal, nothing incriminating. But when she left, he realized he'd been smiling the whole time, something he hadn't done in a while without forcing it. Over the next few weeks, her visits became more frequent. Sometimes she had an actual car problem. Other times it was just an excuse to stop by. She'd linger by the counter, teasing him about his serious mechanic face or asking about his favorite bands. Mark started looking forward to those moments more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't long before they exchanged numbers. At first, it was about her car. "Do you think it's safe to drive with this noise?" But soon it turned into late-night messages about movies, food, life. Jenna was easy to talk to. She didn't pick apart his words or make him feel like he was under a spotlight. With her, he could breathe. One rainy Thursday, she stopped by after the shop closed. Mark had stayed late to finish some paperwork, and she showed up with takeout in a brown paper bag. They ate at the counter, talking about nothing and everything. At one point, she brushed a bit of sauce from the corner of his mouth, and his heart pounded in a way it hadn't in years. It was only a matter of time before things went further. A few weeks later, they met at a small motel off the highway. Mark told himself it was just to escape, just for one night. But once it happened, the floodgates were open. They began meeting regularly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for more. He knew it was wrong. He knew Teresa would explode if she ever found out. But he also knew that for the first time in years, he felt alive. Teresa noticed the change. She couldn't put her finger on it at first, but she sensed something was off. Mark was spending more time at work, more time on his phone. She started asking more questions, showing up at the shop unannounced again. He tried to be careful, keeping his phone locked and erasing messages, but secrecy had never been his strong suit. The breaking point came one evening when Mark came home later than usual. Teresa was waiting in the living room, his phone in her hand. She had guessed the passcode, his birthday, and gone through his messages. Her face was pale, her eyes hard as glass. "Who's Jenna?" she demanded. Mark froze. There was no point in lying. The evidence was right there in her grip. "It's not what you think," he started, but she cut him off with a laugh that had no humor in it. "Not what I think. You're screwing some little tramp behind my back, and you think I'm stupid enough to believe you." The fight that followed was nuclear. She hurled insults, accusations, even a coffee mug that shattered against the wall inches from his head. At one point, she stepped so close that he could feel the heat of her breath and hear the low, venomous words. "You think you could just walk away from me? I'll sit on you until you stop breathing. Don't think I won't." Mark didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Teresa snored beside him, the weight of her body pressing down the mattress. In the darkness, he realized something had shifted permanently. The marriage was beyond saving, and now there was a threat hanging over him that he couldn't ignore. A week later, he told Jenna he was leaving Teresa. Jenna warned him to be careful, that women like that don't let go easily. He promised her he'd handle it, but in the back of his mind, Teresa's words replayed over and over, as vivid as the night she'd said them. He didn't know then just how literal she meant them to be. The night it happened, the air inside the Collins house felt heavier than usual, thick with tension, the kind that makes your stomach knot before anything even happens. Mark had made up his mind earlier that day. He was leaving. He'd spent weeks telling himself he needed to wait for the right time, but after months of sleeping next to a woman who threatened him, who tore him down every chance she got, he decided there was no such thing as the right time. Only now. Teresa had been working a late shift at her part-time job. Mark used the empty hours to gather his things. He didn't pack much, just clothes, some tools from the garage, and a photo of him and his sister from when they were kids. Everything else he'd leave behind. He didn't want the argument that would come from trying to take anything she might claim was hers. He just wanted to get out alive. He had his duffel bag zipped and leaning against the front door when he heard her car pull into the driveway. His pulse quickened. Maybe he thought he could grab the bag and walk past her before she even knew what was happening. But the moment the door swung open, he saw the look in her eyes, the sharp, narrow glare of someone who already knows. "Where do you think you're going?" Her voice was low, almost calm, and that scared him more than if she'd started screaming. "I can't do this anymore, Teresa," he said, keeping his tone as even as possible. "It's not working. I'm leaving." Her eyes flicked to the duffel, then back to him. "You think you can walk out on me? After everything I've done for you? After everything we've been through?" "Teresa." "Don't Teresa me," she snapped, stepping forward, blocking the door with her body. She was close enough now that he could see the sheen of sweat on her forehead, smell the faint mix of fast food grease and cheap perfume. He tried to sidestep her, but she moved with him, her bulk filling the narrow entryway. "Get out of my way," he said, his voice rising. Her eyes lit up with something dark, triumph, maybe. "Oh, I'll get out of your way," she said, and then she shoved him. The push sent him stumbling backward into the living room, where he landed hard in the old, sagging recliner. He tried to stand, but before he could, she was on him. Literally, the full weight of her body crashed down on his chest, forcing the air from his lungs in one brutal burst. Mark gasped, trying to suck in breath, but her mass pinned him in place. He felt the couch cushion give way beneath him, the wood frame groaning under the strain. "Teresa, get off." The words came out in a wheeze. She didn't move. Instead, she leaned forward, her forearms pressing against his shoulders, locking him in. Her face hovered inches from his, her eyes wide, almost wild. "You think you can humiliate me? Run to that little tramp." Mark tried to push her off, but his arms felt weak under the crushing pressure. Each breath was shallower than the last, panic setting in as black spots danced in his vision. He kicked his legs, hoping to shift her weight, but she only adjusted, planting her feet and settling even heavier on him. "You're not going anywhere, Mark," she said, her tone eerily calm now. "You belong to me. You've always belonged to me." His chest burned. His head pounded. He clawed at the armrest, at her clothes, at anything he could grab, but it was like trying to move a boulder. The seconds dragged like hours. Somewhere in the haze, he thought about Jenna, about how close he'd been to getting away, about how stupid he'd been to think he could outmaneuver someone who had already promised exactly how she'd do this. His vision narrowed, the edges going gray. The last sound he registered was the creak of the recliner under them and the steady, deliberate sound of her breathing, unbothered, unhurried, while his own failed. When she finally stood up, it was over. Mark's body slumped sideways, limp. She stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling, her face unreadable. Then, as if shaking off a trance, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice when she spoke was high-pitched, panicked, almost convincing. "My husband. He's not breathing. I think he passed out. Please, send someone." She added a sob for good measure, pacing the room as though she'd just stumbled upon the scene. She didn't mention the fight. She didn't mention how she'd pushed him or sat on him for what felt like an eternity. She didn't mention that she'd warned him, more than once, exactly what she would do if he ever tried to leave. By the time the paramedics arrived, Teresa was crouched beside him, hands on his shoulder like she'd been trying to shake him awake. To them, it looked like a freak accident, a tragic mismatch between a small man and a much larger woman. She stuck to her story, voice trembling as she said, He just fell asleep in the chair, and then he wasn't breathing. Outside, the neighborhood was still. Only the flash of red and blue lights broke the quiet. Inside, the truth sat as heavy as Teresa had minutes earlier, pressing down, suffocating, waiting to be uncovered. If anyone in that room had looked a little closer, they might have seen it in her eyes. Not grief, not shock, but the cold, quiet satisfaction of someone who had done exactly what she said she would do, and gotten away with it, at least for now. From the moment the paramedics declared Mark dead, Teresa slipped into her role like she'd rehearsed it. She clutched her chest, pacing the living room, repeating the same lines to anyone who would listen. "I don't know what happened. He was just sitting there." And then her voice cracked in all the right places, her eyes glistening but never spilling over. Detective Carla Briggs, one of the first on scene, made note of the woman's size compared to the victim's, but she didn't press. The initial working theory was simple, tragic but not unheard of. Mark, a small-framed man, may have been accidentally crushed or suffocated during some sort of awkward tumble. A freak accident. The paramedics had seen stranger things. Teresa leaned into that narrative hard. While the coroner's van pulled away with Mark's body, she sat on the couch, careful to sit on the opposite end from where it happened, wringing her hands and talking about how Mark had been tired lately. She mentioned his bad back and that he'd been out of breath more than usual. She never outright said heart attack, but she planted the seed. When Detective Briggs asked if there had been any arguments that night, Teresa gave a weak laugh and shook her head. "We've had our ups and downs, sure, but tonight? No, he was just quiet. I thought he was mad at me for something small. Then he just slumped over." Her performance was convincing enough that Briggs didn't push it. Yet. The death was logged as pending autopsy, and for the moment, Teresa was free to play the grieving widow. She played it well. At the small memorial service a few days later, she wore all black and clung to Mark's sister, murmuring, "I don't know how I'm supposed to go on." She posted a series of long Facebook statuses about their unbreakable bond and the man who made me believe in love again. Friends and acquaintances flooded her comments with sympathy, but behind closed doors, her behavior was different. Within a week, she'd boxed up most of Mark's clothes and left them on the curb for donation. The duffel bag he'd packed the night he died had vanished entirely. When a neighbor asked if she needed help with anything, she smiled and said, "Oh, I'll manage." Teresa also started quietly securing her finances. She contacted the bank about accessing their joint accounts, citing immediate expenses, and reached out to Mark's life insurance provider. In those conversations, her voice was clear, steady, none of the tremble she used when talking to police. The police reports still framed the incident as accidental, and for a while, Teresa seemed untouchable. She even joked to a co-worker that she'd probably scare off any future boyfriends because of what happened to Mark. The co-worker laughed, not realizing the layers in her words. Jenna, on the other hand, wasn't buying any of it. She didn't come to the memorial, knew it would be a scene, but she kept in touch with one of Mark's friends from the shop. When she heard the accident theory, she felt physically sick. Mark had told her about Teresa's threats, word for word. "I'll sit on you until you never get up again." Jenna went to the police, but without evidence. All she could offer was hearsay. Teresa must have sensed that Jenna was talking, because she made a point of showing up at the shop one afternoon, standing in the doorway like she owned the place. She chatted casually with the guys, even bought coffee for everyone, as if to say, "See, I'm not the villain here." To the outside world, it was a sad, bizarre tragedy. A small man, a much larger wife, a moment of bad luck that ended in death. It fit neatly into a category people could understand, and Teresa was careful not to step outside the lines of that story. But Detective Briggs had seen too many cases to take the easy answer at face value. She filed the details away, the size difference, the lack of physical struggle marks, the perfectly timed memory loss in Teresa's statements. For now, the official narrative was accident. But something about the way Teresa's eyes stayed dry, even when her voice broke, told Briggs this wasn't over. Teresa didn't know it yet, but her freak accident story was already starting to fray. And the harder she worked to make it sound believable, the more it began to sound like script. It was the coroner's report that cracked the first seam in Teresa's carefully stitched story. Detective Carla Briggs received it on a gray Tuesday morning and read it twice before calling her partner over. The cause of death was listed as asphyxiation due to prolonged chest compression, with multiple fractured ribs and deep bruising across the sternum. The report noted the injuries were consistent with sustained external force, not a sudden collapse or fall. Briggs went back to the crime scene photos. The recliner where Mark had been found showed deep indentations in the cushions, the fabric pulled taut in a way that suggested it had borne far more weight than it was designed for. She compared that with the coroner's time of death estimate in the 911 call logs. There was a gap, several crucial minutes unaccounted for between the probable moment Mark lost consciousness and Teresa's call for help. It was enough to warrant a second look. Briggs started with the neighbors. Most were polite but hesitant. Nobody liked getting in the middle of someone else's marriage. But then she knocked on the door of Martha Dugan, the retired schoolteacher next door. Martha didn't mince words. "I heard them fighting that night," she said, loud enough that I turned down my TV. She was yelling something about him running off to that little slut. And then it got quiet, real quiet. Martha leaned closer, lowering her voice. She's told him before she'd sit on him until he stopped breathing. I thought she was joking. Guess not. Briggs wrote every word down. It matched almost exactly what Jenna Wallace had told her earlier, a statement that had been brushed off as girlfriend drama during the initial intake. Now it didn't look like drama. It looked like motive. She called Jenna back in. This time, Jenna came prepared, bringing a small envelope of printed text messages Mark had sent her. One, dated 3 weeks before his death, read, "If I ever turn up dead, check the couch. She's been threatening to crush me for months." It was a gut punch. Briggs secured a warrant for Teresa's phone records. What they found painted an even uglier picture. In the weeks before Mark's death, Teresa had searched for terms like how long to suffocate someone and can sitting on someone kill them. She had also looked up life insurance payout timelines. With the pieces falling into place, Briggs brought Teresa in for questioning. In the sterile interview room, Teresa stuck to her script at first. Mark fell asleep. She thought he was having a heart attack. She panicked. But when Briggs slid the printout of the search history across the table, the mask slipped for just a second. Her eyes narrowed, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Then she leaned back in her chair and said, "You're twisting things. I was worried about his health. That's all." Briggs didn't let up. "You were worried about his health, but you never called a doctor. You never took him to the ER. What you did do was wait several minutes before calling 911. Why?" Teresa's answers got shorter. "I froze. I didn't know what to do. I was scared." But the tone was flat, like someone reading from a bad script. The breakthrough came when the lab results from the couch fabric came back. Fibers matched the t-shirt Mark had been wearing, and the pressure imprints were consistent with a heavy object, over 400 pounds, compressing the cushions in one spot for several minutes. It was exactly what the coroner's office had described. Briggs laid it all out for the district attorney. Motive, jealousy, and fear of abandonment. Means, her size, and the physical act of sitting on him. And opportunity, the night he tried to leave. Combined with witness statements, phone searches, and Mark's own text warning, it was enough to move forward with a murder charge. When they came to arrest her, Teresa didn't cry or protest. She stood in the doorway in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, arms crossed over her chest. "You're making a big mistake," she said as they cuffed her. But the smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth made it seem like she still thought she could talk her way out of it. The story broke in the local paper the next morning. Ohio woman charged with killing husband by sitting on him. Within hours, it was national news. Comment sections filled with disbelief, morbid jokes, and outrage. But for the people who knew Mark, there was nothing funny about it. They remembered a quiet, decent man who'd spent his last months trapped in a home that was supposed to be his refuge. Briggs knew the trial would be messy. Teresa was already spinning the story as a tragic accident and claiming the state was targeting her because of her size. But the detective also knew the evidence told a different story, one where weight wasn't the crime, control, rage, and intent were. For months, Teresa had threatened Mark in a way most people wouldn't take seriously. But on that night, she turned the threat into action. And now, no matter how much she tried to rewrite the ending, the truth was finally on record. The trial of State of Ohio versus Teresa Collins began on a crisp Monday morning in late October, and by the time jury selection wrapped, every seat in the gallery was full. Local reporters, true crime bloggers, and even a few national outlets had shown up, their cameras waiting outside for any glimpse of the 440-pound woman accused of using her body as a weapon. Teresa walked into court wearing a navy blue pantsuit that looked strained at the seams, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She didn't glance at the gallery, didn't acknowledge Mark's family sitting in the front row, his sister clutching a folded photograph of her brother. Her attorney, a seasoned defense lawyer named Robert Mathers, stayed close at her side, murmuring in her ear as they took their seats. The prosecution opened first. Assistant District Attorney Kelly Reardon wasted no time painting the picture. "This is not a case about size," she told the jury. "This is a case about control, about rage, about a woman who, when faced with the end of her marriage, decided that if she couldn't keep her husband, no one would." She laid out the evidence. The coroner's report detailing asphyxiation and multiple rib fractures, the indentation in the recliner matching prolonged compression, the threatening statements Teresa had made to both neighbors and the victim himself. And then she read Mark's text to Jenna aloud. "If I ever turn up dead, check the couch. She's been threatening to crush me for months." The words landed heavy in the silent courtroom. A few jurors glanced toward Teresa, who sat stone-faced, hands folded in her lap. When it was Mather's turn, he leaned hard into the tragic accident narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes awful things happen without intent. My client loved her husband. They had their problems like any couple, but love was there. That night, something went wrong. An accident that's now being twisted into a sensational story because of her size." He implied that Mark might have had underlying health problems, that the fractured ribs could have come from CPR, and that the prosecution was trying to turn a domestic tragedy into a spectacle. Witness testimony began with a medical examiner who methodically dismantled the CPR theory. The rib fractures, he explained, were at angles and depths inconsistent with resuscitation attempts. The bruising pattern indicated sustained downward force, not compressions from above. "In my professional opinion," he said, "the injuries are consistent with a heavy object pressing on the chest for several minutes." Then came the neighbors. Martha Dugan took the stand and told the jury exactly what she'd told Detective Briggs about the shouting that night, about hearing Teresa accuse Mark of running off with that little slut, and about the eerie silence that followed. "I remember thinking it was strange," Martha said, her voice steady. "Too quiet, too suddenly." Jenna Wallace's testimony was emotional. She recounted her relationship with Mark, the threats he'd told her about, and the last conversation they had when he said he was leaving Teresa for good. When Reardon asked about the text message, Jenna's voice cracked. "He knew," she said. "He knew she might do something like this. He didn't think she really would." The defense tried to paint Jenna as a bitter mistress, suggesting she had reason to see Teresa punished. But Jenna didn't flinch. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about the fact that Mark told people he was afraid of his wife, and now he's dead in exactly the way he feared." Throughout the trial, Teresa's demeanor shifted subtly. At times she appeared bored, leaning back in her chair and glancing around the room. Other times she'd put on a show of dabbing her eyes when particularly damning evidence was presented, though no one in the gallery ever saw an actual tear. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecution introduced the internet search history from Teresa's phone. The words glowed on the screen for the jury to see. "How long to suffocate someone? Can sitting on someone kill them? Life insurance payout timeline." Reardon's voice was sharp as she asked the jury, "Does this sound like a woman who was simply worried about her husband's health?" In closing arguments, Reardon reminded the jury of the gap between Mark's loss of consciousness and the 911 call. Those minutes were the difference between life and death. She had time to get up. She had time to call for help. She chose not to. Mathers, in his final plea, urged the jury not to let emotion override reason, insisting the state hadn't proven intent beyond a reasonable doubt. But his words felt thin compared to the mountain of evidence. It took the jury just under 5 hours to reach a verdict. When they filed back into the courtroom, you could feel the air tighten. The foreperson stood, hands trembling slightly, and read, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Teresa Collins, guilty of murder in the 2nd degree." Teresa didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She simply closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them and stared straight ahead. Mark's sister let out a sob, clutching the photo tighter. Judge Harmon sentenced her 2 weeks later. 28 years in state prison, no possibility of parole until she'd served at least 24. You use your body not in love, not in passion, but as a weapon, he said from the bench. You turned a home into a crime scene and a marriage into a death sentence. As deputies led her away, Teresa finally broke her silence, muttering loud enough for those nearby to hear, he deserved worse. It was the first honest thing she'd said in the whole trial, and the last anyone in that courtroom would ever forget. Teresa Collins entered the Ohio Reformatory for Women in early December, shackled at the wrists and ankles, wearing a state-issued gray sweatsuit that did nothing to hide her size. She was assigned to a low-security wing at first, but her notoriety quickly spread through the prison. Inmates whispered the headline like it was a punchline. The woman who sat on her husband to death, but in the cafeteria and the yard, no one laughed in her face. Her sheer physical presence kept most people at arm's length. Inside, Teresa settled into a routine. She worked in the laundry, kept mostly to herself, and maintained the same narrative she'd told from the beginning, that it had all been an accident. Outside the prison walls, the ripples of what she'd done were still spreading. Jenna Wallace left Ohio within months of the verdict, moving to a small town in Kentucky to escape the attention. She didn't talk much about Mark anymore, but those closest to her knew the trial had left scars she'd carry for life. Mark's sister, Denise, became the most vocal voice for domestic violence awareness in the county, giving interviews and speaking at local events. Abuse doesn't always look like bruises from a fist, she told one audience. Sometimes it's control, threats, the kind of fear you can't photograph until it's too late. She started a small nonprofit in Mark's name, offering resources for people in emotionally and physically dangerous relationships. Detective Carla Briggs moved on to other cases, but she kept a photo of Mark pinned to her office board. A reminder that sometimes the hardest part of the job is convincing people that a crime can happen without a weapon. Weight didn't kill him, she told a rookie partner once. Choice did. In the years that followed, Teresa tried to appeal her conviction twice. Both attempts failed. The evidence was too strong, the verdict too solid. She remained in prison, her health declining as she moved into her mid-40s. Guard said she still talked about Mark from time to time, never with remorse. Only bitterness that he'd betrayed her by leaving. The Collins house sat empty for a while after the trial, then was sold to a young couple who knew the history but didn't care. They ripped out the old recliner, gutted the living room, painted over the faded beige walls. Still, neighbors swore that on some nights, when the street was quiet, you could almost hear the echo of a man's voice shouting for air. For those who loved Mark, the trial's end wasn't closure so much as the end of a chapter. The grief remained, tucked into everyday moments. An empty chair at the holiday table, a number still saved in a phone they couldn't bring themselves to delete. Teresa's story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher tragedies. But in Ohio, people still remembered. Not because it was sensational, though it was. Not because it was grotesque, though it was that too. They remembered because it forced them to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. Love can turn into something deadly, and the most dangerous threats aren't always made with knives or guns. Sometimes they're whispered in the dark, dismissed as a joke, until the night they come true.